Okay, where's that? Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Global 60s Colloquium. It's really wonderful to have you all with us, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Quito J. Swan. Professor Swan is a historian of Black internationalism and global Black political movements, and he's professor of history and director of Africana Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., the United States. His work has helped reshape how we think about the geography of Black internationalism. His award-winning book, Pacifica Black, Oceania, Anti-Colonialism and the African World, is published by NYU Press in 2022, and it brings the Pacific into conversation with the Caribbean and the broader African diaspora. And it also received the 2023 Best Book Award in African American History. Professor Swan is also the author of Paulu's Diaspora, Black Internationalism and Environmental Justice, published by University of Florida Press in 2020. It was awarded the Pauli Murray Book Prize, as well as the Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization, published by Palgrave in 2009. Which traces the global dimensions of Black Power movements. His more recent work, Born a Sufferer, Dancehall Music's Insurgent Soundscapes, published by Bloomsbury Publishing 2025, turns to dancehall music as a powerful space of political expression and diasporic exchange. Across his scholarship, Professor Swan traces the movement of ideas, of people, and cultural forms across both the Atlantic and Pacific worlds, offering a truly global perspective on Black liberation struggles. Professor Swan has held fellowships from institutions such as the National Endowment for the Humanities, Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute, and the University of Queensland in Australia. And his work has appeared in leading journals, including Radical History Review, the Journal of African American History, and the International Journal of Africana Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Quito J. Swan, who will be speaking today on Black internationalism, Oceania, and the Caribbean. Professor Quito.
Brother Amqua, thank you so much. Really looking forward to our discussion today. Really happy to be here as part of the Global 60 Colloquium. Also want to thank Nisha for the invitation as well. We initially were to do this last year, but I was under the weather, so I'm glad we finally will come together. Just give me a brief second to share my screen.
Right.
Let's make sure. Okay, can we see that?
Yes.
Great. So in thinking about Oceania, and my talk today, I've been also thinking through the idea of just setting a timer, firstly. The idea of that comes out of Oceania is the thought of being too dark for the world. And I'll explain that as we go on. And also, while I'm going to engage the Caribbean, this talk is also really going to engage the African diaspora more proper, particularly Africa's connection with Oceania as well. So I want to start with a quote from a major figure in Aboriginal movements and across Oceania, Oodgeroo Noonuccal, who in 1976, at the first independent Papua New Guinea Writers' Conference, asked, "Is it too much to hope that for long, the Black artists of the Pacific will meet yearly to celebrate in the Black Pacific Festival of Arts?" Uh, this is actually a really profound statement and very important to how to engage my work. And I think the Black Pacific is growing as a major unit of analysis, for Black movements across Oceania. Uh, you have Afro-Asia, Black struggle in the Pacific coast of the Americas. But to have a term like the Black Pacific emerge from a Black artist in Oceania is very important because many times, scholars of the African diaspora can attest to when we raise questions of Blackness globally, often there's a pushback or questions are raised of are we projecting terms or ideas from Western experiences on the global Black world? Um, but to see Black Pacific as a term emerge from Oceania was very important for me and my own work as well. This also centers a space like Papua New Guinea as a major site of discourses on Blackness, Black modernity, what it means to be Black, Melanesian as well. Because while the West, through magazines like Time or National Geographic, frame a space like Papua New Guinea as a land, before time, in the context of Black movements in Oceania, Papua New Guinea is also a form of Black modernity or the future of Blackness in Oceania. And I'll explain that as I go further. What makes Noonuccal also really important is that she is of a generation of a civil rights kind of orientation of Aboriginal activists. She was a national leader in Australia. But her son, Dennis Walker, who is to the right, who's dressed really fabulously in a leather jacket, helmet, and shades, he actually founds the Australian Black Panther Party. So Noonuccal and her son Dennis actually formed this really interesting mother-son generation of Aboriginal activists that kind of span the scope of Black politics globally in some way. To the left is a poem she writes. She also was known as a poet, probably first and foremost, on a British Airways sick bag um, that she writes while she's on her way back from being on the steering committee for an Aboriginal Australian and Papua New Guinea delegation to Festac. We know Festac as this Festival of African Arts that takes place in Nigeria in the 1978. She's a part of that movement. But that's another discussion. Hopefully, we may have time for that. What is the Black Pacific? The Black Pacific, from my perspective, is a transoceanic framework, also an assertive methodology and political praxis that situates the epistemologies and ontologies of Pacific Blackness within the Black radical tradition. The Black radical tradition is really being used heavily by scholars for some time now. Um, but I think for me, focusing on Oceania is part of an intervention on what we call the Black radical tradition, particularly in looking at some of these oceanic contours. Although it's not, in some ways, I think I'm raising new ideas. In other ways, I think I'm opening up conversation that have been taking place across the Black world. And I'll explain that some more. The larger, or the second kind of point of orientation for me is this quote by Francis Bogotu, who is from the Solomon Islands, and he makes this statement also in Papua New Guinea, 68. It is a big disadvantage in this world to be Black. The trouble with us Solomon Islanders is that we are too Black. But this is also very important because once again, here we have a really profound expression of Blackness, not only coming from Oceania, but coming from Melanesia, coming from even smaller Solomon Islands, which is a space that's really marginalized when we think of Blackness. But for me, this quote by Bogotu also speaks to how the Blackness of the Solomon Islander, the Blackness of a Melanesian, which literally means island of the Blacks, just named that by European colonizers, is almost an experience that's too Black for the rest of the world to understand. In other words, where does the Blackness of the Melanesian fit within our paradigm of Blackness that is usually focused on the Atlantic? Despite the fact that Melanesians and Polynesians, and that's in quotes, would be racialized and colonized as being Black and brown, For the most part, this is a diaspora of voluntary migration to Oceania that existed thousands of years before the Atlantic slave trade. So where do you fit a diaspora of this context? Now, obviously, for those who study the Indian Ocean, those who study the Pacific, we're well versed in some of these dialogues. But it's interesting how, you know, in terms of popular culture, we tend to forget what we've already discovered. And so this is also a pushback against a sense of historical amnesia. Dr. Joseph Harris practically founded African diaspora studies by looking at Indian Ocean and African experiences in the Middle East. So, once again, Papua New Guinea. The University of Papua New Guinea is a really important space for understanding Blackness. It was formed by British/Australian administrations to create a new class of Papua New Guineans who would basically usher in a form of neocolonialism. Uh, but within a few short years, it's founded in 1965, detractors are calling the university a Mau factory. And this was a reference to Kenya's Land of Freedom Army and the notion that there's this Black radicalism that's emerging from the university that wasn't intentional. And this is to some extent, not obviously, we should push back against this notion that these are just, these radical folks about some kind of connection to uh real traditional liberation, because that's the implication. And um the university literally ushers in a new kind of Black arts movement through students, through faculty, including faculty who studied in Nigeria or from Nigeria or from the African continent, the Caribbean. And every year, the university will host these seminars around what it meant to be Melanesian: politics, history, culture. And so students, faculty, and scholars, well, scholars from across the region would actually have these intense debates around Melanesian. What emerges in the same moment is a Black Power movement, including the New Guinea Black Power movement, which is founded by students at the university in 1970. You see on the left a student named Leo Hannett, who is from a community in Papua New Guinea in Bougainville. To the right, there's a student newspaper, Niladat, which means our word. Uh, and this group described itself as a Black Power movement that was kind of literally they described it as being an African Negritude Black Power movement, which is fascinating because you see in the Guinea Black Power movement, these students were not just simply carbon copying, thoughts of Black Power, but significantly engaging ideas of Black Power from Fanon, from Ture, from Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism, into what it meant to be Black in New Guinea. So they framed this movement as an anti-colonial movement. They also were artists, they were playwrights, they were novelists, they were poets, and they built a tremendous canon of content in journals, in magazines that proliferate across Oceania and really launch what we now know as Pacific Studies. But I would argue that this dynamic of this Melanesian arts movement is very much marginalized when we think about Pacific Studies. Now, what's striking about this, and what I've discussed so far, is how just a snapshot of how oceanic leaders looked at Black power or defined themselves on the terms of Blackness. The project also engages how did the icons of Pan-Africanism across the world include Oceania in the frameworks of global Blackness. And so here we have my favorite Bob Marley album, Survival. We could debate this. I don't have a personal stake in proving it, but I think in terms of Pan-Africanism, I think this album is clear. It's about Black survival, global Black survival. There's the image of the packing slave ship. On the back cover, there are quotes from Selassie, quotes from Garvey. Once again, a very Pan-African album, which also the cover suggests 49 flags, African flags. But there's one flag on this album cover that's not out of Africa. Usually I would ask the audience to point out that flag, but I'll just fast forward to the bottom, bottom left, there from the left is the flag of Papua New Guinea. So here we have an artist like Bob Marley, very visibly placing Oceania, placing Melanesia in the context of Black survival, which once again speaks to this has been a long-standing conversation. This image, I ask my students every semester, where is this photo? Where do they think this photo is from? They usually say Louisiana or Jamaica. They recognize the sugar cane. They point out maybe that's a white overseer and their women who clearly look like they're working in the fields. This is not Louisiana. This is a photograph from Queensland, Australia, in the late 19th century, which is reflects how some 65,000 laborers from Melanesia, largely places like Tanna, today's Vanuatu, were forcibly captured and worked in places like Queensland, Australia, and sugarcane and cotton plantations, also in Fiji, often at plantations that were established by former U.S. Southern Confederates who moved the operations to Oceania after the U.S. Civil War. Um, this labor system was known as blackbirding, and these photographs circulated across the Black world. So even Du Bois, who on his way to the first Pan-African conference in London with the likes of Henry Sylvester Williams, also had stopped in Paris for the Paris World Fair, where he met Pacific Islanders, and they had a grounding space of shared experiences, which is very typical. So when Du Bois makes a statement that the problem of the 20th century is the color line, he mentions Africa, he mentions the Caribbean, he also mentions the islands of the seas. That's actually a reference to Oceania. So this is really, and this is part of the point. Even some of the early architects of Pan-Africanism had a sense of a blackness of Oceania. So my work was also trying to undercover or unpack some of those ideas. I should speed up a little bit. Merce Tate, the first Black woman to get a PhD in international relations in the United States, also wrote and taught extensively across Oceania. She wrote a lot about Blackburden. She actually taught at Howard University for decades and was a teacher of Joseph E. Harris. So we see a tradition of a globalness um, of understanding that also comes to a HBCU kind of Howard paradigm as well. That is part of this broader tradition. My own work, my own interventions in the region was through the lens of Black Power, where one of the key figures in Bermuda's Black Power movement, his name was Paulo Cameron Fago. He organizes the 1968 Black Power Conference in Bermuda. Um, he does an interview about Black Power's relevance to Australia. He's invited to Australia by a group called the Aboriginals Advancement League. And he goes in the late 1960s, he invites Aboriginal activists to a Congress of African Peoples meeting in Atlanta in 1970. Then he goes on to be involved in movements for decolonization across Oceania, particularly in Vanuatu. So across these three books, in trying to unpack Black Power, Paulu's work globally, I came across this whole sea of Black consciousness in Oceania, which is really what today is about. This photograph is uh, of two of the activists I mentioned from Australia. Patricia Corowa, who actually was from a family that was blackbirded. Bob Marzer, another Aboriginal activist and playwright, and Paulu. These photographs are courtesy of Australia's ASIO, Australia's Security Intelligence Organization, which would be similar to the FBI in the United States. Uh, Taking photographs of Paulu as he enters Australia. They were very much interested in Black Power movements by Aborigines and surveilled them intensively. There were X amount of files about surveillance of Black Power movements in Australia haven't been really unpacked yet. So today is Melanesia. And for the rest of my talk, I would just briefly canvas different movements across the region. Is really important to think about the diversity of the space. These movements aren't even, but when we think of Melanesia today, we are talking about Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, West Papua. And I want to make the point up front, this also is about the notion of arrested decolonization, because New Caledonia still remains a colony of France, still a major producer of nickel for France. West Papua is a colony of Indonesia, which has created a ton of issues for the region. So this is still, when we say the Black Pacific is also about political praxis, it's just the understanding that these movements are still in need of support. And in seeking support, Black struggle, Black political movements in Oceania reached out to the Black world. But even in doing so, this form of Black internationalism had to form bridges within Melanesia itself and then Polynesia. So the point here is that when we think of Black internationalism, the easy thing is to just jump to the West. Uh, but it's also very important to look at how these different struggles within Oceania had tensions and also places of alliances within the space of Oceania itself. This is the photograph that I was happy to come across in the archives, the National Archives of Vanuatu, which is a really, really radical archive of Black political protest. Which also, encourages us to think about how we decolonize an archive, or what is the archive, right? So for students of Black internationalism, we go to London's archives, right? We go to the Schomburg. We should go to Schomburg. We go to Paris. We should go to these places. But the work also shows there are other sites. For example, in Oceania, like Vanuatu, there's the Dakars of the world. So the archives are very important when we think of a Black Pacific. This is a photograph from 1978 where Vanuatu, at the time, New Hebrides, rather, they're in a vicious fight against British and French colonialism, simultaneously in what was known as a political condominium. Paolu is very involved in this struggle. Uh, the Wanawaka Party, which led this fight, was headed by Walter Linney, who was a very much student of Pan-Africanism. He pretty much used influence retort in his push to liberate Vanuatu, that the independence of Vanuatu was meaningless if the rest of Oceania was not free. This is literally Kwame Nkrumah saying the independence of Ghana is meaningless, the rest of Africa is not free. Through Paulu's work, uh, his Wanawaka Party sends a delegation to the Sixth Pan-African Congress, Tanzania, in 1974, which is a huge moment in terms of the Black Pacific. Pacific Islanders from Vanuatu put on the table the concerns of the Black world in Oceania. Activists like Hilda Linney traveled globally. She was the head of the Wanawaka Party's women's wing. And they were able to build this movement that draws off, two colonial powers. They themselves were inspired by a longer struggle. I mentioned West Papua. This is a document from West Papua national groups from the 1960s, voice to the Negroids in the Pacific to the Negroids throughout the world. Obviously, we know where the word Negroid fits in the problematic world of scientific racism. But once again, it's striking that here's an example of Pacific Islanders from Melanesia using a language that they know the Black world will resonate with. They created this pamphlet to push for independence against Indonesia. They were formerly colonized by the Dutch. They circulated newsletters or statements like this: Papuans seek help for Negro brothers and sisters. Documents like this traveled through African American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier. Uh, this voice of Negroes was sent to leaders like Haile Selassie and Nkrumah. Uh, they unsuccessfully, the fight was unsuccessful. And they felt that they didn't get as much support as they thought they would get from the Afro-Asian bloc because some of the leaders, and this is their language, were quote unquote blinded by Bang Dong. This is huge because while Blang Dong is heralded as a major moment of Afro-Asian solidarity, and it should, Indonesia also used Bang Dong as a reason uh, to legitimize its plans to colonize West Papua. What's striking is that West Papuan nationalists did get support from none other than Leopold Senghor, one of the architects of Negritude, who's not often remembered to be the most politically insurgent, but he allowed this West Papuan group to establish a base in Dakar, which they used to further organize from. I think it's a really striking moment for Senghor's political life in the 1970s. Uh, these are some images from, well, obviously we're in Angola and MPLA. We know the story. Mozambique is Frelimo. There's also a story of Oceania and anti-colonialism that runs through uh, the Black Lusophone world. Uh, one of Portugal's colonies in Oceania is East Timor, which also, after uh, the dictatorship of Portugal falls, uh, East Timor is aggressively captured by Indonesia. So we have Indonesia aggression in a few different locations. East Timor borders on what we can call Melanesia or other groups, Polynesia. It's one of these spaces where it's a gateway um, geographical location for really early migration of different kinds of peoples, but it's still framed as a site of Melanesia. What to me was really striking was to see how the connections between anti-colonialism East Timor and Africa were. Uh, During the colonial era of the Portuguese, several activists from East Timor were exiled to Africa and found themselves in prisons with leaders of the MPLA in Angola. And it started to form these connections. So during the independent struggle against Indonesia, Friedland emerges literally in East Timor as a version of Frelimo in terms of the name. Frelimo, the MPLA, uh, Ahmed Cabral's PAIGC in Cape Verde, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. They all created support and bases for these activists from East Timor at the UN in Africa. And this is a major story of where, in this case, this engagement of Africa and Oceania across the Indian Ocean actually results in liberation or helps East Timor in its long-standing guerrilla struggle against Indonesia, which really was bitter. But in the late 1990s, they achieved independence. I don't think those connections aren't talked about enough. And in the last few minutes I have, I'll just kind of blaze through. This is a picture of Samoan poet icon art Albert Went um, in the office of New Zealand's Polynesian Panther Party. This photo is a discussion in and of itself. The Polynesian Panthers actually were the first Panther formation that emerged in Oceania. As I mentioned, New Caledonia, or we could say the Kanak, the indigenous Kanak, are still in a fight against French rule in New Caledonia. They heavily studied Fanon. You see also when you think about diaspora formations in a place like Paris, there were several students who get involved in this Black Power anti-colonial fight against the French. Were in Paris, met other, Black Francophone folks like Sheikh Anta Diop, President African. There's a huge connection with these freedom fighters of art and poetry. The French were extremely concerned that the liberation struggle in New Caledonia would be like a contagion that would influence Black freedom struggles in Mozambique, sorry, not Mozambique, Martinique and Guadeloupe, which also remain colonies of France. Activists like Susanna Winnie traveled across the world. This is the flyer of one of her tours across the United States, where she goes from California all the way to Howard University, discussing their fight. As I mentioned, Fanon was very, very important. Uh, Fanon's Black, Rest of the Earth, his essays, um, his approach was very much captured by these freedom fighters. This is the photographs of Negritude, a New Caledonian freedom fighter who becomes a political prisoner, as many of the activists did. She also traveled globally as part of this broader Black internationalist vision of these freedom fighters. This photograph, which also is the cover of the book, is literally taken days. This is from New Caledonia. This is taken days before a major French assault on these kind of communities is about to take place. This is circa 1983. Finally, Fiji. This is the photograph of a major activist from Fiji, Amelia Rukatuvuna, who not only was an architect of the Pacific women's movement from Fiji, but also a key player, key organizer in the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement, which was a major movement of indigenous Pacific Islanders that comes out in the 1970s, headquartered in Fiji, which is pushing back against nuclear testing in Oceania by France and the US. And they also argued that there's also the issue of independence. They argued that these colonizers tested the nuclear weapons on the region because they were colonized. And so the only reason they could halt nuclear testing was to be independent. Two of her major mentees, Vanessa Griffin and Cliff Slater, who were seen to the right in this picture, uh, became major activists in Oceania, particularly around Pacific women's groups, and were also very helpful in terms of how I framed this work in terms of which archives to go to and read them with content. Finally, this is a photograph of myself and Vanuatu of activists from New Caledonia, West Papua, Vanuatu, who were allowed to use Vanuatu as a space in their continuing fights against colonialism, which also reiterates the point of how the Black Pacific is not just about how we study an historical moment, but it's also about the contemporary realities of Blackness and anti-colonialism. Thank you for your time. I look forward to sharing questions or having questions.
Thank you so much, Quito. I think you raised a bunch of in your presentation. I really like the subject of inquiry, right? Because on one hand is the subject of Black internationalism and how it conjugated historically different iterations across different
Mhm.
geographies. Um, and on the other hand, you're looking at the specific for a space that is normally not spoken about
Mm,
in the archives. It's mostly overwhelmed. The archives are usually overwhelmed by Black Atlantic
yes.
scholarship and methodologies. And I think picking the Pacific also critiques the other
Mm,
prisms of looking
mm,
at Black internationalism. And I think this is one of the beauties of the work to really look at a phenomenon and then look at its iteration somewhere else, where it also critiques what was historically called Black internationalism. I think one of the things I want us to unpack also for our audiences would be that, first of all, the oceanic paradigm is so critical coming from especially a people who have always been in excess of any nation state, including in Africa, right? So that part, because the whole idea of the modern or European modernity and the organization of society into nation states, even on the African continent, made people not fit into those nation
Right.
states. And
Right.
so these solidarities kind of emerged, contesting that space, but also going beyond. So they're in excess and they're transcendental of those spaces and so on. So I think for me, this is really critical to explain to folks that the phenomenon we're looking at are people who historically, especially in the history of the modern world, are actually disavowed by any national framework for subjectivity
Mm,
and
mm,
citizenship. But
mm,
as human
mm.
beings, their subjectivity cannot be taken. So they've
Right.
got to find it somehow, somewhere. And I think that the humanism of creating new paradigms of being, new places of belonging, are some of the things that I think what you're saying exposes that in the Pacific, for the people who live there, why are they looking outwards? It's because inwards they don't belong. And they have to imagine a belonging that actually resonates elsewhere to create a broader. And two things that comes to mind is I remember Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer,
Mm,
in
hmm.
one of his books wrote about, in Africa, the first time Africans thought of themselves continentally, historically, was the Haitian Revolution.
Mm,
So
mm.
otherwise,
Wow.
they thought they saw
Wow.
themselves
Wow.
regionally,
Right.
but the Haitian Revolution made them
Mm,
look at that excess
mm.
and then think, oh, by the way, we live on a continent
Uh,
where we're not only described by routes, but actually it's the roots for other people who
Yes.
went somewhere else. Um, and I think for me, those are important aspects of the work of the Black Pacific, which I'm hoping that will continue to gather resonance because most people have done work on Black Mediterranean, Black Indian Ocean,
Right.
and now, of course, the Black Pacific is so rich in its diversity, and it's also in the historical continuity of colonization, because a lot of them don't believe, even if they want to be citizens of those islands belong elsewhere, like
Right.
similar to the Caribbean. So I guess my question would be how the Pacific comes into conversation. Say, let's start with the Caribbean, which is as diverse as the Pacific.
Well, firstly, thank you so much for your comments. And I think you said it so beautifully. There were communities in Papua New Guinea that didn't know they were colonized, quote unquote,
Wow.
until independence, because
Wow.
they were so remote in terms of how Europeans thought, right? They were so over there.
Right.
It was really flag independence or flag
Wow.
colonization for some communities that were allegedly colonized by Germany. And then here's a new nation state that on the way of framing itself as a new nation has to interrogate where does Melanesianness fit into how we identify ourselves. So when Papua New Guinea goes independent, it's sending a delegation to Festac is really a big deal because you have a new nation saying we're part of the Black world. That's a
Right.
very conscious choice made at the nation state level. That
Right.
if you compare that to Australia and Aborigines, is a totally different perspective because Aborigines, through the genocide, were only some
Right.
2% of the population
Right.
versus a black mass large island that now is telling some of these, quote unquote remote groups, your rainforests are now part of our nation state.
Yeah.
And that also
Yeah.
creates certain tensions,
Yeah.
in the creation of the nation state that may not have been as pronounced during
Yeah.
colonialism. So it's these interesting dynamics. And then in a place like Vanuatu, that is really more of, you know, it's an archipelago that has so many islands. There are these differences that were there. And some islands were controlled by the French,
Right.
some controlled by the British,
By the
but the
British.
same colony. So that's a whole nother
Right.
thing that has to be worked out.
Right.
You have a Fiji that's bordering itself on ideas of being Polynesian, but is Melanesian. How does that work? Uh,
Yeah.
and so even thinking about some, as you mentioned, these beautiful multi-ethnic kinship networks that include the ocean, long before in colonialism, it's colonialism that puts people in the islands and says you're part of this island or this colony, as opposed to, wait a minute, the whole ocean, this whole region is a space that we navigate and we negotiate space and
Yeah.
time. And but the Caribbean context is really important. I remember, myself being from island of Bermuda, seeing myself as very much Caribbean,
Mm.
see myself as someone who enjoys Caribbean foods like
Mm.
breadfruit.
Right. Right.
And then you get to Oceania and you say, oh, breadfruit actually comes from
Right.
Pacific. And like,
Right.
wait a minute, how?
Right.
And so like
Right.
think about these colonial networks, but the food base makes sense between the blackness and indigeneity. And this is commented on by several folks. Like the first thing, folks who travel, they see
Yeah.
is the food, right? And the
Yeah.
things we eat commonly. Like I was told, you know, you haven't had pineapple before. So what do you mean I haven't had pineapple before? Of course I've had pineapple. So no,
Yeah.
that's you haven't had pineapple.
Right.
And they were right
Right.
about that one. So I think so there were those kind of connections. One of the connections that struck me was during the Haitian Revolution. I'm really glad you brought that up. There was this
Mm.
notion that the Caribbean's in uproar and Europeans are having ideas, and the British included. The Pacific is a peaceful place. I mean, they imagine this, right? Like they imagine Polynesia as this peaceful, pacifying place. And
Mhm.
maybe it's the food. Maybe it is the breadfruit. So if
Mm.
we bring breadfruit into the Caribbean, maybe it will help pacify these Negroes in uproar. And so some of these really strange colonial networks take place like that. And they literally take there's one, popular journey where these two farmers from Polynesia are taken to the Caribbean to grow
Mm.
breadfruit and other Pacific Island foods. They never return home. Those connections fascinate me. Then you
Yeah.
have connections of, Caribbean sailors who go all across the world in the 19th century. There's this amazing moment of when Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight
Right.
boxer,
Right.
wins his title match in Sydney. uh, there's a Caribbean association, or there's a Black association, a colored people association rather, that's throwing parties for Jack Johnson. This is a mixture of Aborigines, Aboriginal folks, African American sailors, Caribbean sailors, African sailors, and this is who Jack Johnson is around. And some of those leaders go on, some of those persons go on to form Sydney's chapter of the UNIA. So there's connections with Amy Jacques Garvey communicating with this branch. And Jack Johnson's fight is actually banned by the British in some of the islands because they're concerned that the natives will get inspired by his
Yeah.
fight. So I think
Yeah.
there are these long-standing connections that I think are just being kind of unpacked between the Caribbean and Oceania that I think are really rich
Yeah.
sites to explore further.
Yeah. So I know there are people asking questions, but I wanted to say one thing and then I'll pivot to the audience. So the 60s was a pivotal
Mm,
moment, a watershed moment, right? Because in the African continent, cultural movements from the Negritudists to the Pan-African
right,
movement were really resonating. And indeed, even the Black Panthers were resonating by
right.
going to African countries to be part of the liberation movements. And so we saw that connection from the United States with, as a matter of fact, when Mantia Diawara and I were making a film in Guinea,
Mm, mm,
one of the guys who was a postal clerk told us the story of the first day Kwame Ture walked into the post office. He was so tall, and they were like, please make way for the Tubab. Tubab means white man. And
Wow.
he left
Oh
America
man.
as an abused
Oh,
black man. He went to
oh,
Guinea. He was called a white man because he came
wow.
from somewhere else. So it was those kind of paradoxes. But the
Mm,
60s, I thought, as a watershed moment, and I guess that's the platform of this colloquium as well. It was a moment where there was a groundswell of social movements,
yes.
cultural movements, and also contestatory narratives
Mm,
against what was built in 1945 after the
mm,
World War,
mm.
Second World War. So I was just wondering, in revisiting that time and looking at today, some of the things that need deconstructing is nationalism and internationalism, and then the
Right.
black
Right.
inflection of that
Right.
as well.
Right.
And so that what we will know as black nationalism with pride in the past is challenged in the present as a form of
Mm,
ethnocentric retreat, right? And then on other hand, you get a situation where um, the various movements that we see in the Caribbean and even in the Pacific Islands, they were referencing this liberation movements, and
yes.
they were active participants in the counterculture. So that the Black
Yes.
Pacific, as you mentioned it, reminds me of Gilroy's idea of the Black
Mm,
Atlantic as a counterculture to
mm,
European modernity.
mm,
Would we say
mm.
in the same breath that the Black Pacific is also a counterculture to the European modernity that defines it? And if that, how does the 60s show us some of the elements of that counterculture?
Great question. Really, really quickly, I'll start by saying, so you're absolutely right. The Black Pacific, in terms of academia, right, academic ideas may seem
Yeah,
as a challenge or a critique of Black Atlantic. But in the reality of the 60s, the Black Pacific is really a challenge to a white Pacific,
correct.
which is a
Yeah,
different thing in terms of colonialism, a white
I
Pacific
see.
of
I see.
colonialism, modernity.
Yeah,
Australia is founded, quote unquote, in 1900 around the idea in this constitution that what they call terra nullius, that no humans were there before the British got there.
right,
So, and that's white modernity in Oceania.
right,
That's a white
right,
Pacific. No one's here before we get here. And
right,
so in the late
right,
1960s, I started with Oodgeroo Noonuccal. She was part of a group called FACATSI, which was the Federal Council of Aboriginal and Australian Torres Strait Islanders. The whole emphasis was a movement just to get Aboriginal peoples included in the census. And they win this in 1968. So this is actually, for Australia, a groundbreaking moment. It's the first time that Aboriginals might be even considered as citizens in
right.
Australia.
Wow.
And this is in a moment of the emerging Black Power movement that's
Right,
going to push the question for we just don't want acceptance. We want land rights, right?
right,
We want Black Power on our terms. So Black Power is heavily important in Oceania. Toure was on the stop list, by the way. He wouldn't have been allowed in
yeah,
Australia. And you see, um, you know, Black Power activists in the Oceania being put on stop lists across the region. The French and the British are collaborating to
right,
prevent certain organizers. Paolo himself is deported um, from Vanuatu.
right,
And I knew him, we were really close. And I remember him telling me the story of how he was put in the plane and how villagers blocked the plane with the cars on the tarmac.
Wow.
And I just thought that sounds exciting, but okay. Surely didn't happen exactly
Yeah,
like that, right? And then I go to Vanuatu and and you look in, the British archives and I actually see, wow, this actually was true. The British were about to send in, hundreds of troops to
yeah,
take out one person, and the Vanuatu party literally blocked the plane. And I
right.
actually found photographs of the plane. So I think
Wow.
Black Power is so huge, but it also speaks to, as you mentioned, a shifting of the state or a reflection on how the state is changing its networks of or expanding networks of surveillance and
Mm,
control to continue to surveil um, this emergence of Black consciousness that's also about to be also political
right.
liberation. Um, you have organizers traveling to Black Power movements or Black Power meetings and Pan-Africanist meetings in the 60s. And so I think Black nationalism is really important in that context. But
Yeah,
also, when we think of the 60s as a site of where anti-colonialism really manifests,
yeah,
and into the 70s, Oceania also shows us how the legacy of colonialism continues into the
yeah,
80s, because you have organizers who cut their political teeth in the 60s, still pushing for liberation in the 80s
yeah,
and 90s. So I think it's also a broadening of maybe a long global 60s as
yeah,
well. I mean, that's what
yeah,
Oceania kind of
yeah.
invokes.
So it's like the long 60s, so to
Yes,
speak.
indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And so there are some four questions that in the chat box I'll read out. One of them starts out by saying, of course, you made a compelling case for Oceania Africa nexus. How does it sit alongside Oceania's connections to other regions in the long 1960s, the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and indigenous North America? Were there hierarchies or asymmetries of solidarity? Or were there areas that were more generative as a horizon for identification?
This is a great question. Thank you, Martin. For
You can tell it's a historian that's wrote this.
it's a fascinating conversation. Definitely all of the above, right? This is at least in my space, I'm looking at at least some 7, 8 countries. Um, so there are definitely hierarchies. One of the larger hierarchies, which is why the notion of a Melanesian arts movement is important, is because colonialism frames Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, right? Europeans do that. Indigenous folks do not do that. So
Mm,
part of the project of the 60s is to push through those categories.
yeah,
But
yeah,
you can only push through those categories by putting them on the table. And so there were hierarchies of colonialism. In other words, Polynesian is the land of the noble savage, the redeemable savage, right?
yeah,
These people are defined as being lighter and they can sail because maybe there's a lost white tribe who taught them how to sail, which
yeah,
puts them in the category. And the women are beautiful and the
yeah.
men are peaceful, which contrasts them with Melanesia, dark, unredeemable,
Right,
cannibals, can
right.
sail,
Yeah,
no culture,
yeah,
can be redeemed, no
yeah,
resources we even want. So I
yeah.
think that's a hierarchy. That's an immediate hierarchy that the
Right,
60s has to address, like this internal colonization. And
right.
I think the most amazing space that I have seen in my work is the nuclear free and Pacific movement is probably the broadest space where these things are these solidarities are, and I don't use the word flatten as a negative, but maybe some balance,
Mm,
because the argument, and it's true, is that no matter what we look like, where we are, nuclear testing is impacting all of us.
right,
All
right.
of us.
Yeah,
Uh, Issues of rising sea levels impact all of us.
right,
The health conditions as a result of nuclear testing impact all of us. So that nuclear free Pacific movement is probably like the most generous space for uh, a new Oceania of identity.
right,
You
right.
mentioned the Caribbean. Apile Haufa, who is an icon of Pacific studies, he's from Tonga, which is, defined as Polynesia, but he
Mm,
grows up in Papua New Guinea because his parents are missionaries. He does field work. He does a degree in anthropology in Australia. He does a master's in McGill in 1968, right around the Walter Rodney incident and Black Power
wow.
issues in
Yeah.
Montreal. Does field
Yeah.
work in Trinidad. Goes back to teach at University of Papua New Guinea, adjacent to the New Guinea Black Power group. So when he's the one who really frames the idea of a new Oceania,
Mm,
but is also a part of all his own experiences in Black and brown spaces that allows him to do that. So the
mm,
Caribbean is important for him. He's lived across these borders of, you know, ethnic identity. He knows the
mm.
pitfalls and the strengths, and he speaks about pitfalls of continental consciousness,
Yeah.
which makes us
Yeah.
see the islands as being insignificant.
Right.
Because,
Right.
and so this made me think about, wow, what are some of the pitfalls of
Right.
my own continental country? Although I'm raised in the Caribbean
Right.
island, but my
Right.
hierarchies were that the Caribbean is ocean is we're island people. Then
Right.
you get to Oceania, it's like, wait a minute, no,
Right.
these are island people.
Right.
We're becoming island people, right? In a
Right.
place like Bermuda.
Right.
In other words, 100 of years of society versus thousands of years of
Right.
islanders. So
Right.
I think the so I think so in the space of the nuclear anti-nuclear testing, there's definitely connections with across the
Mm,
Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Latin America. There's always
mm,
there. The
mm.
indigeneity is always there.
Right.
So, for example, Aboriginal activists in the Black Power era, Australia would say we read Malcolm X's autobiography of Malcolm X just as much as we read Barry Mahart, Wounded Knee. They
Right.
saw themselves as Black and Indigenous and it not being something that is in
Right.
contestation.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right. Every time you mention Melanesia, what it invokes in my head, my friend Carl Phillips and we informally talk about it. We call it the figments of the pigment. So it's like all the figments of history that
right,
generates
right,
how because what you
right.
said about Oceania
Oh,
also transcends the Black modernity because it's
yes,
really global. It's about
yes,
human existence and
yes,
so. But
yes.
every time I hear Melanesia, I think melanin, and I think it adds
Right,
to my archives of the pigments of the pigment. But
right.
I want to continue. They come back to some of the questions that somebody is saying, and this is a very important question about what you refer to as the radical archives. And the radical archives, where do you find them? What's their custodianship, right? Where they're located? What are the conditions of access to them? Um, right, and also about what is the documentation process of producing the materials that go into that archive? How they're collated by state authorities, intelligence services, right, law enforcement. Where are and how are these radical archives? But of course, what you're talking about is that there is a phenomenon called the radical archives.
Yes.
And there is a convention of accessing it through activism. But where it is takes us back to one of the things that Glissant talks about, the
Mm,
right to opacity.
mm, mm.
That just because an anthropologist goes to talk to the natives does not mean what the native tells them is authentic, right? So,
Right, right.
but
Wow.
I want you to respond to the idea, especially with relation to Black Pacific. Where are these radical archives? There are
Right.
some obvious ones, but in their complexity, what is it? Where is it? And how do you access it?
Well, I mean, this is such a great question. So what we do as scholars. We apply for grants and we map
Right.
out our research agendas. We find the libraries, the collections, and so I was able to do this for Australia relatively easy,
Mm.
because it's a labyrinth of materials. I
Right.
also would say this is one of those things where you kind of grow as a scholar, right? And
Yeah.
you take lessons you learn from earlier projects and your
Yeah.
mistakes and the things you did well, and you
Yeah.
try to do better. So Black
Yeah.
Power in Bermuda was actually where I learned how to try to balance the state archive with the other archive of the activists I was interested in. So Black Power in Bermuda, I definitely use intelligence documents from Britain, Canada, US, FBI, CIA, M15, M16. But I had to balance that with local activists of this group called the Black Ray Cadre.
Right.
But to find the members of the Black Ray Cadre, which was very suppressed, uh, access came through my father also being a part of this movement.
Okay.
So my father gave me access to, these former activists who now, worked in a store and nobody knows who this person is, right? Or somebody
That's
just this person's a painter on a construction site. Nobody
right.
knows who this person is, or some folks in government. So, but because there was my father that was like, oh yeah, let's talk to Swan. The same thing happens in Vanuatu. Now, Vanuatu very much the project of Vanuatu in the independence movement was to see itself as a radical space, which I would say they saw themselves also as a Cuba of
Mm.
Oceania. So
Mm.
they intentionally have an archive. They intentionally archive the liberation struggles and their support for other struggles. So that's an intentional archival, you know, project. Um, but it wasn't obvious in the sense of access to it also came from me also knowing Paulu, who was very important in liberation struggles, and his family members, which gave me access to some of these former, leaders who were very, very important people in Vanuatu's history. But in my moment, live in a very humble home,
Mm.
and you wouldn't know who they are.
Right.
So I needed, some personal access to find out where where are folks. Um, and some of that it's not always intentional work. Sometimes you make mistakes. You don't know where you're going, all right?
Right.
And these are things we don't talk about as scholars. It's like
Right.
the
Right.
serendipity of things. Like sometimes when things happen that we didn't plan, like the elegba of it, we don't talk
Right.
about a lot. So I think that's also something to kind of, for me was important. It's like not always knowing, but I think trying to have a balance between the state's archive
Mm.
and the other radical archive is
Yeah.
very important, and it's still something that you work on. But I think for me, balance is very important, and I don't think I'm always as successful as I would
Mm.
try to be. But
Well,
that's kind of the inspir. That's kind of
yeah.
aspiration
No, but
of it.
it's also the fact that there are formal as well as informal archives,
Right,
right? And people, it depends on how you want to access it. And indeed,
right,
and this is where I was invoking Glissant's idea of opacity, giving
mm,
people the, it's part of their strength to be opaque and not be visible,
mm,
because
right.
that knowledge can actually be used to hurt them. So,
Absolutely.
and that's why the archive can, it's contestatory, right? That
Yes.
it's not considered a safe representation or record for people who feel dominated, because it's
Right.
like
Right.
speaking in one language
Right. Right.
exclusively.
Mm,
And yeah, well, so there's another question which
okay.
it was supposed to be the last one, but I'll go to it first before what will be the last one. Was the question was about continuity of the rupture with the 60s moment in Oceania and the Black Pacific, right? The rupture as compared with other world regions whose 1960s have been more canonically narrated. This is interesting, and is that what does that comparison demand of a global 60s historiography,
mm,
particularly its periodization and the Atlantic center of gravity and its tendency to read the era as a closed chapter rather than an ongoing horizon? It's interesting the question for me too in my scholarship and work that there is an open-ended because structure of forming the knowledge, creating it in its visible structure, and deliberately
mm,
fragmenting it into
mm.
bricolages and then reassembling it. And so that
Right.
rhythm is what the scholarship, and I'm kind of answering the question, but it equates this for me. It resonates with me that one of the particularities of social movements is that they will canonize knowledge, especially in its oppressive discourses,
Mm,
but
mm,
they do so to fragment it and they
mm.
put it in
Right.
different forms of bricolage and then they reassemble
Right.
it. So that the
Right.
whole idea of Black Pacific, Black Atlantic, Black Mediterranean is part of that. And it's
Right.
rupture and reassemblage is the rhythm of knowledge
Yes.
making and knowledge storage. So that it's
Yes.
so that and the 60s, I think, was a fantastic moment that brought the asymmetries of the world together in different
Right.
congregations, political groups, cultural groups,
Right.
revivalism groups, etc. So that you look at the Rastafarians, right? I go,
Right.
you look at because I like Bob Marley going to that part of the world, or how he resonates in that part of the
Right.
world. So that there's a whole idea of really flipping things that look obvious on their head and then reassembling
Mm,
them. And so that moment of fragmentation is a permanent process. It can be seen
mm.
as rupture, but for people who are subordinated, rupture is what they do best. But
Indeed.
what's your
I
response to it, by the
don't think I have a better answer than that. I think like that's that's the answer. No, but, no, but I love the reference to rhythm
Yeah,
because I do think about, and this is also one of the reasons why I wrote the dancehall book,
yeah,
because I realized that my methodologies in the other books were so driven by music
right,
and substance culture that I hadn't really just been overtly, it was very, it was the opacity of my own work. It was there
right,
but not there. So I think about things in rhythm a lot.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so the rhythms of, let's say, Black Power in Papua New Guinea that start in the mid 1960s, right? That are around art, what it means to be Melanesian, which for this New Guinea Black Power group, it means to be anti-colonial. It means to
right,
rupture, right? It,
right,
it means to also study but critique Nkrumah.
right,
So they're literally saying we disagree with Nkrumah's seek ye the political kingdom. We want the cultural kingdom because that's what we need. We need to decolonize ourselves to
right,
engage in Malcolm. Um, the rhythm that these students start in the mid 60s don't really manifest in a more national sense until the mid 1970s when Papua New Guinea goes independent. So there's something about the rhythm started in the 60s, but it's not manifested until the mid 70s. So if we cut off, you
yeah,
know, this thing by the 60s, we missed the rhythm.
right,
It's like a Fela song. Fela hasn't
right,
started singing yet, right?
right.
Like,
Exactly,
we
exactly.
we got
Yeah,
we got the rhythm, but
yeah,
we haven't even heard his voice yet. So
right, right.
that's the longest 60s
Yeah,
part. And I
yeah,
think that also, and then it has its own, rhythms that are it produces. So for Black Power in Australia, for example, um, which comes out of the 60s, that's going to transform into this Aboriginal tent embassy movement that's pushing for, you know, sovereignty.
Yeah.
And that still has, when I went to Sydney, you you still had Aboriginal groups doing these same kind of formations where they will occupy space.
Right.
But it's a 60s rhythm that
Right.
in the 70s is looking at Papua New Guinea's independence.
Right.
And then Vanuatu's rhythm also is a early 70s rhythm that doesn't really mature until Vanuatu goes independent.
Right.
So
Right.
all the language of Vanuatu's national movement about
Right.
blackness, Pan-African internationalism, can't be really manifested as a thing until Vanuatu goes independent, which is 1980. But the rhythm
Yeah.
started in the early 70s.
Yeah. Yeah. You know,
So I think that's the
yeah, it's fantastic. That's a good response to it. I was also thinking about the reference to the 60s was that the 60s was a moment of emergence for nation
mm,
states. It was the most
right,
coherent moment for
right,
nation states who were at the other end of the spectrum. But it was
right.
also a moment of emergence for counter nations.
Yes,
Right, and
yes,
which became movements. Some of them became nations, of course. But if
right,
you think about when the United Nations was formed, there were only two African countries there, right?
right,
And then
right,
fast forward to the 60s, there were many more, right? But even when there were many more in that emergence, the energy of decolonization bifurcated into now we've got a nation, we're fine, to decolonization as a permanent process of
right,
fragmentation
right,
and
right,
reassembly.
right.
And which is where we are the needle leans further and further that direction
Right.
than the belief in the nation states. So it's a good question about how do we go back to the idea of the 60s? But the
Mm,
question is, who's going back to the idea of the
right.
60s? When the
Mm,
60s, what
mm,
was coherent for some people was a moment of countercultures to
right.
nationalism and
Right.
internationalism.
Right.
And I think that's a very good spot to look at where Black Pacific features in that because, in fact, from its distance, from its obscurity, is also a
Mm,
counter knowledge
mm,
to
mm,
because
mm,
we always want to know
mm.
everything, measure them, the taxonomy, and
Right.
they fall out of that taxonomy
Right.
of
Right.
nations and societies that can be accounted for. So I think that
Well,
that's why the Black Pacific it iterates it beyond what the Back Atlantic did or the other paradigms do. And I think that's a very good spot to look at the uniqueness of the Black Pacific as the continuous fragmentation of the logic and taxonomy of nation states and so on. So that for me, I wouldn't even call it internationalism anymore.
mm,
To really
mm,
be social movements that
mm.
transcend anything global, global social
Right.
movement that transcend the national space because they've declared that they are always in excess of nation states and they're always an anomaly in the logic of nation states and internationalism, you know. But let me go to the last question on the board.
Well,
And yeah,
I do want to respond. I think that's a
yeah,
very
yeah,
fantastic provocation. So
yeah,
another example, Uli Beer. Uli Beer, Jewish German scholar, University of Ibadan, worked
yeah,
on the Black Office Project
yeah.
um,
I worked with
in
him too.
Africa. Oh
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, yeah,
Here-
yeah,
Here's, here's a
yeah.
huge figure in the narrative because him and his
Right,
wife, Georgina Bear,
right,
uh, after they leave Africa,
right.
Nigeria,
They went to
they go
Papua
and
New
teach
Guinea.
at
Yeah,
Papua New Guinea. So it's
yeah,
really, Uli Bear is one of the professors, and there are others from Southeast Asia and
yeah,
Africa as well, who literally take the work of Black Orpheus, the methodology of here's a cassette recorder. go back to the village, record the oldest elder, get the songs, get the poetry. That's actually how this New Guinea Black Power group built the canon. So here's a here's a clear example of a method that was used when Africa goes independent, or
Right.
Nigeria in this
Right.
case.
Yeah.
That method of reclaiming history and
Yeah.
culture being put into Papua New Guinea context in the 60s.
Yeah.
As an but once again, this is the for from the African context, this has already
Yeah.
happened, and
Yeah.
now we're independent, and this is how it manifests in the new state. In
Yeah.
Papua New Guinea's case, the rhythm is just starting. Papua New Guinea is not going to be independent for another 10 years, but the rhythm has started. But there's a clear 60s moment of decolonization.
Right.
After decolonization, starting decolonization, that Africa is connected with this context.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was really phenomenal how these
Yeah.
networks
Yeah.
transpire. Also, was troubling in the moment. Once again, going back to the other center of the archive, there's the emergence of CIA, um, you know, M156 sponsored projects, where the creation of magazines and journals
Right.
and
Right.
do
Like
family
transition.
transitions
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's during
Yeah.
Oceania as well.
Yeah. But
And
Wale Soyinka is a faculty member at NYU Abu Dhabi, and he
wow, I
actually
didn't
has,
know that.
yeah, he's responded to that in a recent publication
Mm.
on
Oh, I need to
intervention.
see it.
It's called
Ah,
Interventions. It's a series of long essays. And also,
wow.
if you go to London now, there's an exhibition called Nigerian Modernism. There's a
Mm,
whole section on the Black
mm,
Orpheus because Wale came
wow.
out of the Black Orpheus
Right,
because he was mentored by Uli Bayer um, as well. So, and then in Germany, in Bayreuth, you'll find the archives of Uli Bayer's
right,
activities,
right, right,
both in Papua New Guinea as
right.
well as in Nigeria.
Mm, mm,
But it's an amazing interconnection that's
yeah,
worldwide, and I
right.
think that's the beauty of it. And I think for me, it's a different way of looking at an area that's so overstudied by European
Mm,
anthropology.
right,
You know,
right.
you think the number of anthropologists who studied that part of the world, you would think that they will be the most advanced part of the world. But it's a kind of a noble and a discourse of noble savage, right?
Yes.
And
Well,
the primordial ideas of human communities and so on. But let
well,
me
I
go
would.
back to the
Well,
last question, and then we'll come back before they kick us out. Yeah. We have
Look,
so much to
I
talk
have to come
about.
back to the anthropologist part. I
Yeah,
have to,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
wait. I'll wait.
So, your reference to nuclear testing was quite striking and makes creates a lot of curiosity about how central is anti-nuclear activism to the global 60s in Oceania. So, and how do we see comparable transnational uh, cross-cultural networks uh, uh, kind of coalescing around it, linking, say, the Pacific Islanders with Japanese islands and
Hmm.
European peace movements, for instance?
Yeah, great question. In the '70s moment, the definitely so the first formation is really called the Nuclear Free Pacific Movement.
Yeah.
Uh, but then that gets pushed to be Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, and it has different versions across the '70s, starting with Fiji. But once again, when Vanuatu goes independent, they started to host these movements, so now they can do more. So there's another life
Mm.
that they sponsor. But for the older activists, they would say that the energy of the '70s, which at the time included Japanese activists, European activists, Canadian activists, is a very, you know, cross-ethnic space. It There have been attempts to kind of regenerate these movements in the past 10 years or so. So there is
Mm.
another life cycle. But the older activists would say there was a dormancy that they weren't really happy about because the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement wasn't just about nuclear testing. It was about these other
Mm.
things. that are
mm,
connected with nuclearism, particularly around
mm,
climate change. As I mentioned, rising sea levels, the temperature of the sea. These things are in Oceania. These are real things. Like the ocean. They can see they're experiencing these dramatic sea levels rising in their lifetimes. It's not afar. It's like there already.
mm.
Um, so I think there's a resurgence that may not match the visibility of the
Right.
70s, but it's there if it's being looked for. It's there.
Mm.
It's
And
there.
it's embedded in their cultures of everyday life.
Yes, and also what the visible struggles. So the same communities who are the activists who are pushing against nuclear testing are also saying West Papua should be free. New Caledonia should be free. So there's still this broader kind of focus
Mm,
um, around this idea in one sense of what's
mm.
called one Sawara, which is really means one water, one people, which also comes from Solomon Islands, is embedded in Creole languages in the region,
Right.
which is really one people, one ocean, but it's become this rallying cry for politics, environmental justice and the
Mm,
likes. But I do want
mm.
to just end on the anthropologist piece. So
Right,
Margaret Mead,
right.
of course, she cuts her teeth in Papua New Guinea, and literally the New Guinea Black Power Group, she's at UPNG when this group is formed. And this group literally, some of the members literally, and I'm not even being pejorative, they literally came straight from the village to the university. And this is
Nice.
important for the 60s. And
Right,
so
right,
they actually they actually disrupt some of her lectures and say things like, that's not what my grandfather said, or that's
right,
not what my grandfather did. Where are you getting this? So
right.
there's a critique of me in the moment that gets invisibilized more globally. So
Yeah,
there's a pushback to the anthropologists from these
yeah,
groups in the
yeah.
moment that we don't, I think was just starting to kind of,
Yeah.
recognize in some ways. But for these
Mm.
activists, the anthropologists are not
Yeah.
friends by any
No,
stretch
I
of the
know.
imagination.
Well, yeah, well, it's
In the
related.
60s.
Yeah, it's related to the archives question too, that
Right,
it's a well archived part of the world, but the
right,
people, it's not about them.
right.
In
Yes,
other words,
yes,
they are
yes,
objects in the archive. They are not subjects of the archive.
yes.
So
Absolutely.
there are
Agree.
subjectivities. Not all of them are visible enough, and but there are
Right,
cases of deliberate opacities, as
right,
Gusan writes. And I
right.
think the other thing I think that what I love the concept of the Black Pacific because it really, as you said earlier, it critiques what we was so well established in the Black Atlantic studies. It critiques it because the Black Atlantic um, paradigm almost became an assimilationist narrative. It
Mm,
was like we were
mm,
dispossessed, but give us a chance,
right.
we will be good citizens. But I think this one takes us back to this what I was saying about fragmentation in continuity, because the
Right.
knowledge, the archive is in the energy of the fragments, not
Yes.
in the well-formed structures. And I think it's also important to use it to look at, say, the African continent, that
Mm,
in Africa, is so paralyzed by ethnocentrism, so that
mm,
the whole idea of, you know, what is African diaspora when the continent is
mm.
itself diasporic, right? So
Yes.
it almost forgives Africans for thinking there was some originality to them, like they sprouted out of the soil. But it's a continent that was created by movements of people from one
Absolutely.
end to the
Absolutely.
other. And I think this particular Black Pacific story is a good way to question and critique the essentialisms of African cultures themselves. So it kind of goes like a right back at the system that inspired it in the first place, it kind of
Right,
goes
right,
back
right,
to
right, right,
question their
right,
limitations to
right.
show that if you're looking for the assimilation of people in this nation states, you've picked the wrong phenomenon, right? And I think this is what makes it exciting and daunting for scholars as well. But I can't thank you enough. I'm hoping
No, thank
we'll
you.
re- I'm hoping we'll restage it at the Black Portraitures in California
Sure,
as well.
sure.
And I also want to thank Martin and his crew, Nisha and others who made this possible. The Global 60s Colloquium has been there for a long time, but I think this is one of the few times that I'm actually actively participating, and I'm hoping they'll call me back as well. And but to be continued, we will have these conversations continuously. And thank you for the opportunity of sharing these views. And hopefully we'll also transmit this in our local community. There'll be a lot of people who will be excited
Mm.
about this conversation. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. This was great. This was so generative. I
Yeah.
know we could be talking for
I know,
hours.
I know.
So
They'll have
thank
to
you,
come
Martin.
because
Thank you, Nisha.
Nisha will
I
have to say, all right, guys,
know.
it's enough. The party's over. Yeah, yeah. But I really want to continue the conversation. I know my colleagues in the Black Producers Conference will be particularly excited, especially if you look at cultural practices and in those
Mm.
social movements. It's something they're not too familiar with, but it's something that will be very provocative and invited provocation as well. Yeah.
Those are the best kind of convos.